The marble corridors of the imperial palace held many secrets, but few were as carefully concealed as what happened during the interregnum. Those dangerous hours between an emperor's death and his successor's arrival, while Roman historians meticulously documented political successions, recording which senators gained influence and which families fell from power, they remained curiously silent about the women of the imperial household. These women simply vanished from the historical record, their fates left unspecified, their experiences reduced to vague phrases about retirement into private life. To understand why this silence existed, we must first understand the unique position of Rome's Praetorian Guard. Established by Augustus as the emperor's personal bodyguard, the Praetorians had evolved into something far more complex than a simple protective force. They were 9 cohorts of elite soldiers, the only military unit permitted within Rome's sacred boundary. While legions fought on distant frontiers, the Praetorians lived in the capital. Stationed close to power, intimately familiar with palace politics. This proximity created a paradox. The Praetorians were simultaneously the emperor's greatest protection and his most serious threat. Historical sources document their dual role with uncomfortable clarity. They guarded emperors like Claudius and Marcus Aurelius, ensuring stable reigns. They also assassinated emperors like Caligula, Pertinax, and Elagabalus when political circumstances shifted. The historian Cassius Dio observed that by the 3rd century, the Guard had become kingmakers, their support more crucial to imperial survival than senatorial approval or popular acclaim. The Guard's power reached its zenith during succession crises. When an emperor died, whether from natural causes, assassination, or military defeat, Rome entered the interregnum. This was a period of legal ambiguity, sometimes lasting only hours, sometimes extending for days. During this time, the Senate had no military force to enforce its authority. The urban cohorts, Rome's police force, answered to the Praetorian prefect. The new emperor had not yet arrived or secured his position. In practical terms, the Praetorians controlled the city absolutely. This created what scholars call the interregnum tradition, a set of understood practices that were rarely documented but universally acknowledged. The incoming emperor would provide a substantial donative, a cash payment to secure the Guard's loyalty. The Praetorian prefect would negotiate his own position or retirement, and the imperial palace itself, with all its contents, was understood to be under the Guard's authority until the succession was formalized. The contents included people. Imperial women occupied a unique position in Roman law and custom. They were not citizens with independent legal standing, they existed under the authority of male relatives. An emperor's wife derived her status entirely from her husband. His sister, mother, or daughter held positions defined by their relationship to imperial power. When that power died, their legal protection evaporated instantly. Ancient sources provide glimpses of this vulnerability. The historian Suetonius mentions that after Caligula's assassination, members of his household faced various fates, without elaboration. Tacitus notes that Messalina, wife of the murdered Emperor Claudius, was dealt with by the Guard before Claudius's successor arrived. The Historia Augusta records that when Emperor Pertinax was killed, his widow Titiana sought protection from the Vestals, suggesting she feared remaining in the palace. Modern historians have had to read between these careful omissions. Dr. Sarah Bond, a specialist in Roman social history, argues that the silence itself is revealing. Ancient historians, she notes, explicitly describe the executions of male imperial relatives, the exile of political opponents, the confiscation of estates. But for women of the imperial household, they used euphemisms and vague phrases that suggested experiences too shameful to record directly. The structure of the Praetorian Guard itself provides context. These were not ceremonial troops but hardened soldiers, often recruited from frontier legions, men who had spent years in military camps far from Rome's civilizing influence. They resented the aristocrats they served, the senators who looked down on them as crude soldiers, the imperial family that enjoyed luxuries while they stood guard. The interregnum represented a brief window when traditional hierarchies collapsed, when men who had been servants became masters of the palace they had protected. Roman law recognized this danger, at least implicitly. The legal principle of asylum, which allowed fugitives to claim sanctuary in certain temples, was particularly strong for the Temple of Vesta. The Vestal virgins, priestesses who maintained Rome's sacred flame, were sacrosanct, protected by religious law so ancient that even soldiers feared violating it. Multiple sources record imperial women fleeing to this temple during succession crises. The pattern suggests they had reason to fear remaining in the palace under Guard control. The prefecture of Lucius Aelius Sejanus, who commanded the Praetorians under Tiberius, provides a documented example of the Guard's power over imperial women. After Sejanus's fall and execution, his wife Apicata was interrogated by the Guard, according to Tacitus, before taking her own life. Her daughter faced similar treatment. The sources do not specify what interrogation involved, but the outcome, suicide rather than continued custody, suggests it was severe enough that death seemed preferable. The archaeological and documentary evidence for the interregnum tradition comes from multiple sources, each providing pieces of a larger pattern. Let us examine what we can verify and what remained scholarly debate. First, the physical evidence. Excavations of the Castra Praetoria, the Praetorian barracks in Rome, have revealed quarters for officers that included private chambers separate from common soldier accommodations. These chambers, according to archaeological reports, contained luxury items, imported pottery, expensive furniture, decorative objects that far exceeded a soldier's normal means. Some items bore imperial marks, suggesting they originated in the palace. The most reasonable explanation is that during succession crises, when the guard controlled the palace, its officers appropriated valuable goods. If they took objects, the question becomes what else they took. Second, legal evidence. Roman law from the imperial period contains provisions that seem designed to protect imperial women specifically during successions. A law from the reign of Hadrian, preserved in the Digest, specifies that women of the imperial family could claim asylum in temples without requiring the new emperor's permission. The law's existence suggests the protection was necessary, that without it, these women faced danger serious enough to warrant special legal consideration. Third, comparative evidence from other succession crises. When Emperor Commodus was assassinated in 192 CE, his concubine Marcia disappeared from the historical record immediately. She had been involved in the plot against him, according to sources. Yet there is no mention of her trial, execution, or fate. The most likely explanation, according to historian Dr. Michael Kulikowski, is that the Praetorians dealt with her directly, and the incident was not recorded because it fell within the understood bounds of the interregnum tradition. The case of Empress Plotilla provides more explicit evidence. After her husband, Emperor Caracalla, was assassinated in 217 CE, Cassius Dio records that she was held by the guard for several days before the new emperor Macrinus arrived. Dio notes cryptically that she suffered indignities before being formally exiled. Ancient readers would have understood what indignities meant. The term was a standard euphemism for sexual violation. Modern scholars debate whether Dio's account is reliable, but his use of this specific terminology appears in multiple contexts relating to women under guard custody. The religious practice surrounding the Temple of Vesta provides crucial context. Ancient sources record at least 7 instances of imperial women seeking sanctuary there during succession crises between 31 BCE and 235 CE. This was not standard practice for aristocratic women facing political trouble. They normally sought protection from powerful male relatives or retreated to country estates. The consistent pattern of flights specifically to Vesta's temple, and specifically during interregnum periods, suggests these women faced dangers that other refuges could not protect them from. The silence of the sources themselves constitutes evidence. Roman historians were not squeamish about describing violence. They recorded military atrocities in detail, described public executions graphically, and documented the abuse of slaves and prisoners without apparent discomfort. Yet when describing the fates of imperial women during successions, they consistently used vague language. This selective discretion suggests they were avoiding details that their audiences would find particularly shameful, not because the violence itself was shocking, but because it violated norms about how aristocratic women should be treated. Modern scholarship has approached this topic cautiously. Dr. Alison Cooley, in her study of imperial women, argues that the interregnum represented a collapse of social order when normal hierarchies were suspended. The women who had commanded households of thousands but received ambassadors and influenced policy suddenly had no authority at all. The soldiers who had been required to show them deference could now treat them as they wished, knowing the interregnum's temporary lawlessness would protect them from consequences. Dr. Matthew Bunson's research on the Praetorian Guard emphasizes the economic motivations. The donative provided by new emperors was substantial but had to be divided among 9,000 soldiers. Control of the palace during the interregnum allowed officers to enrich themselves and provided common soldiers with opportunities for profit and revenge against the aristocratic class. The treatment of imperial women, in this analysis, was part of a broader pattern of the guard asserting dominance over the household they had formerly served. What we can say with historical certainty is this: imperial women were uniquely vulnerable during succession crises. They lost their legal protection the moment the emperor died. They could not safely remain in the palace under Praetorian control. Multiple sources document them seeking sanctuary in temples or fleeing the city entirely. Ancient historians used euphemistic language when describing their fates, suggesting experiences considered too shameful to record explicitly, and the pattern repeated across multiple successions over 3 centuries, indicating it was systematic rather than coincidental. What we cannot say with certainty is the specific nature and extent of what occurred. The sources protect themselves through vague language and strategic omissions. We have frameworks rather than details, patterns rather than individual accounts. The very silence that protected these women's reputations in death now protects historical accuracy. We cannot responsibly claim to know specifics that the sources deliberately concealed. The interregnum tradition reveals a darker truth about Roman power. The empire's stability rested on military force, and that force could not be perfectly controlled. For a few dangerous hours during each succession, Rome's most powerful women became Rome's most vulnerable, trapped between one emperor's death and another's arrival, subject to a tradition that history chose not to record. Their silence in the sources speaks louder than any explicit account could. It tells us that what happened during the interregnum was considered too shameful for history, which means it was terrible enough that even Rome's brutal chroniclers looked away.